So thanks very much for the invitation to take part in this. Let me begin with a very brief bit of context about the work that we've been doing at Durham for the Urban Transformations Programme. So I'm involved in a project funded under the Urban Transformations Programme on the politics of urban social innovation, and that's something that I'm doing with Paul Langley, Colin McFarlane, Sue Lewis at Durham, and Antonis Vradis at Loughborough University. And our focus in that project is on, in a sense, unconventional forms of social innovation. So with an emphasis more on the social than, let's say, the kind of the technological innovation. And we've been looking at innovations in relation to food production and provisioning and distribution. We've been looking at innovations in relation to finance, social forms of finance and new financial technologies. And we've been looking at innovative practices in the field of arts and culture. And this is in a European context, so our research is focused on the cities of Berlin, Athens and Newcastle in the northeast of England. But it's not a formal kind of comparative matrix. We're not treating these cities as discrete case studies. We're rather more interested in a series of themes that cut across these places, and we kind of move between the places as the themes take us, in a sense. So one of the aspects of the relationship between social innovation and urban politics that we wanted to think about was how do various forms of resources get enrolled into practices of social innovation, including the energy of social movements and practices of social protest. That was our original intention. I think it has to be said, as the researchers worked out, that the connections are perhaps even more fragmentary than we had originally envisaged. But I'm going to use this as an opportunity to reflect a little bit on what we've uncovered about social movements in the research. So, I mean, the first thing I suppose to say is that I'm actually a little bit uncomfortable with the term social movement in this context, in the sense that to speak of a social movement or any particular social movement, I think gives a kind of a falsely formal, organised, kind of reified sense of what a lot of the mobilisations that certainly that we've studied are looking at. So we're not, in a sense, studying the decadal-long international new social movements, the women's movements, the civil rights movement, the environmental movement, although of course many of the activists that we have been doing research with and collaborating with do draw inspiration from those kinds of movements. So I think what we're looking at really is a series of more fractured and fragmentary social mobilisations, in particular urban settings. And so I wanted to just reflect briefly on the kind of forms of social mobilisation in Europe cities that we, at least as they've appeared in our research. So firstly, I suppose we have social mobilisations that are reactive, a kind of a protest mode, if you like, with various different kinds of targets, often prompted by a single event or decision by a public authority, whether that be a protest against austerity provisions introduced by a national government, whether that be, in the case of Athens, the large-scale mobilisations against the financial measures introduced by the Troika, the European Union, the IMF, and so on, in the Greek economy a few years ago, or whether it be a small-scale mobilisation around a particular decision by a municipal authority. And a good example of that would be a campaign in Newcastle to initially to resist the closure of a much-loved Turkish baths in the centre of the city, and then when it was closed, to campaign for it to be reopened on community interest basis, and that was in fact a successful campaign, and that facility has recently found a new lease of life. Or it may be protests or reactions against corporate decisions, private organisations. So these kinds of reactive mobilisations, there's a question that we want to think about as to the extent to which they are urban, in a sense. I mean, are they urban because they're focused on urban issues like urban service provision? Are they urban in the sense that they use the urban as an arena, that they occupy urban space, that they draw a kind of strength from the built environment in some sense, or are they using the urban as a resource, as a political resource, as a set of social resources? Secondly, we've looked at social mobilisations that engage in various kinds of social justice work or social solidarity. Campaigns around anti-racism, campaigns around welcoming refugees, refugee solidarity, and so on. And these are often crisis generated, so they stem perhaps from a particular event, from the so-called Mediterranean refugee crisis of 2015-16, or from the rise of organisations like Pegida in the case of Germany and Berlin. And those, so that a kind of social solidarity form of mobilisation, and then we've also been looking at giving those sorts of impetuses practical expression. So in the case of our food theme, for example, we've been looking at projects, community-based projects that seek to acquire and allocate surplus food from the urban food system. An organisation like Solidarity Piraeus, which was closely involved in the provision of food to incoming refugees, but actually began as a project to provide more and better food to destitute households in Piraeus following the financial crisis. Also in Athens, in North Athens, in Galatsi, we're interested in the Without Middlemen organisation, which is a collective, neighbourhood collective, seeking to link food consumers, households, directly with food producers to bypass the middlemen, hence the name. And a very interesting group that's been trying to use that as a vehicle for developing a new kind of community solidarity, a new kind of political consciousness amongst residents, so that they use the food distribution events, the kind of sequential. It was monthly, it's now I think fortnightly or weekly distribution points. But they use that as a way of, as people come in to collect the food, they then piggyback other kinds of activities on that, children's arts activities, film showings, discussions, music events, and so on, in order to try and build new kinds of communal and political relationships. We've looked at waste food cafes, we've looked at food co-ops, community gardens, an initiative in Newcastle called Culture Kitchen, which attempts to deal with the fact that under the incredibly restrictive immigration controls of the UK government, that people seeking refugee status are unable to work, they're unable to earn a living, but many of them have extensive skills, so that they use a kind of cooking event to both to capitalise on those skills, to develop further skills, but also then to introduce both the food and the people to the neighbours and the residents of the areas in which they're living, and to use that as a kind of vehicle for attempting to build solidarity. Okay, so and then finally we've been looking at mobilisations that use cultural interventions, so arts practice of various kinds as vehicles for social mobilisation, which address in the content of their arts practices very often issues around social justice, climate justice, anti-austerity, and so on. And a series of projects like ZKU in Berlin, which have organised refugee art collectives, for example, like the Newbridge project in Newcastle, organised a series of month-long interventions, one called Hidden Civil War back in October, which brought a lot of energy and life to the streets of central Newcastle around a series of kind of performance activities addressing questions of austerity and precarity and food justice and other things. So that just gives you kind of a flavour of some of the things that we've been looking at, and then just in conclusion to think about a few of the themes that have come out of this. So the first would be one around temporality. So many of these interventions, many of these mobilisations are quite brief, quite fleeting. They can be quite temporary. That may be because of a victory, as in the case of the Turkish baths, or it may be because of a quick defeat. But one of the questions that we've been asking is how to, in a sense, capture that energy and how can people continue to invest time and commitment and build something that endures. One of the ways of doing that is through solidarity provision, so that you engage in kind of practical solidarity work. But it's also notable that many of these projects are, some of the core activists are new activists, young activists, but many of them are also people with a long history and background of urban activism, dating back to, in some cases, to the 70s, so anti-fascist mobilisations in Greece, for example, from the 1970s, and people who've kind of maintained that commitment over years and have been able to bring it back into play in the current moment. Second theme that we would put out is a tension between the kind of the provision mode, the service provision mode, the practical solidarity mode, and the more political objectives that mobilisations seek to progress. And at one extreme, this kind of tips over into kind of NGOisation or professionalisation, where you start to acquire premises, you start to acquire contracts and employees and overheads, and suddenly you're running a kind of a larger organisation, and even if you maintain your political commitment in principle, this then carries with it all kinds of potential for compromise and all of the groups I think that we've been working with are very acutely aware of the kind of contradictions and risks there. I spoke briefly about temporality. Also space, of course, is hugely important in terms of the use that's made of urban space, but very often the development of kind of particular kinds of spaces in order to further the practices of mobilisation. So whether that be squats or squatted premises of various kinds, whether it be the use of temporary urban space in disused office buildings, the tiny kind of pocket handkerchief community garden in Neukölln that I visited, which was quite literally on the front line of gentrification, because there was a public housing project on one side of it, and there was a new private apartment block which had FUCK gentrification graffitied all the way across the front wall in English. And this community garden was kind of struggling to find a kind of a space in between these conflicts over urban space. And then finally, the big question of the relationship between these sorts of mobilisations and the more formal structures of urban governance. And there is the issue that I think Alex has already mentioned around kind of accommodation or co-optation. And I think we saw that quite acutely in the years after 2010 in the UK, when there was the coalition government's big society agenda and the attempt really to kind of take that kind of Chicago-style community activism and capture it within a governmental agenda that many activists were very uncomfortable with. And a number of mobilisations or groups engaged in these kinds of mobilisations adopt as a kind of counter-strategy to that, effectively an autonomous approach. So a kind of we're going to do our own thing. We're not going to relate to the authorities. We're going to go off-grid. We're going to protect our political objectives and our kind of credibility by failing to engage or refusing to engage with the kind of formal political structures, and I think that's particularly prevalent in Athens, given the kind of history, and particularly the recent history of the Syriza shift in Syriza politics in the last 5 years or so. Then there's a kind of relationship of antagonism, so the kind of the protest mode, but perhaps more interestingly, there's the sort of temporary alliance, so there's the kind of temporary accommodation, not a kind of co-option permanently, and a good example of that would be the work of ZKU in Berlin in relation to their refugee arts project and their efforts to bring into more valuable community use a major site, a disused office building just on the edge of Alexanderplatz called the Haus der Statistik, a former GDR official office block, and the struggles that they've been having with the Berlin city authorities in order to gain the right to use this building for community purposes. So I think there's no straightforward relationship between social mobilisations. There's no kind of direct transmission mechanism. The party structures in most cases in municipal politics don't map on at all conveniently to urban social movements in contemporary Europe. And so these relationships are always going to be unstable, intermittent and shifting, and in a sense of pragmatic. And again, it's, to go back to where I started, it's not really about thinking about a social movement as a grand project, but more in terms of a temporary and shorter term mobilisation. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jen.